Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast. Now, I'm genuinely excited to get today's guest on the podcast. Today's guest is Amanda Brock, and she is the CEO of OpenUK, the UK organisation for the business of open technology in the UK. What I'm talking about here is open source software, open hardware and open data, all with the purpose of UK leadership and international collaboration in open technology. She's also a board member of the Open Source Initiative and appointed member of the Cabinet Office's Open Standards Board, member of the British Computer Society Inaugural Influence Board. And Amanda was also awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award in the Women of Influence and Power in Law Awards back last year, and was also included in Computer Weekly's Most Influential Women in Tech and their UK Tech 50 Influencers long list. But it's her passion for using tech to bring people together that put her on my radar and inspired me to invite her on the podcast, especially the recent State of OpenCon conference, which brought together leading UK and international figures in open technology. But at the heart of all that is an amazing backstory too. But I don't want to reveal too many spoilers, so buckle up and hold on tight, because it's time for me to beam your ears all the way to the UK, where Amanda is waiting to share her story. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Amanda. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. And thank you very much for having me along today. I'm Amanda Brock, and I'm the CEO at an organisation called OpenUK. And we're an industry organisation that focuses on the business of open technology. That sounds really sort of formal and like we focus on companies. And we don't really. We've sort of broken the model a little bit. We're not a traditional industry organisation. We focus on people, and we focus on people who work or want to work in that business of open technology. And that's open source software, open hardware, and open data. And then we work on three pillars: community, legal and policy, and learning. And we bring together that community of people who are working in and around open technology. And we use their collective power, their collective impact and voice to have some influence on laws and policy in the UK and beyond. And then the third thing we do is we build skills around open technology.
Fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure having you on the podcast today. And before we find out more about OpenUK, I want to find a little bit more about you and how you got to your current role and everything that you're doing. So can I ask you share your origin story, where your passion for tech came from, or a moment that put you on the path you're on right now?
That's an interesting and slightly difficult one. So I guess I started my tech journey aged about 10, I think, when I was given a ZX Spectrum for Christmas. And I didn't come from a particularly affluent family. It was obviously quite a big deal to have given me that, and it didn't boot. And I think it probably sat in my parents' attic. Annoyingly, I think they got rid of it because it's probably worth a bomb now. If you think about it, it's never been used.
Yeah.
I didn't have the people around me who knew how to fix it or how to make that work. And my tech journey continued disastrously in that I had been lucky enough to have a scholarship to a private school locally, and they taught coding towards the end of my time there. So you're talking 85, 86.
Yeah. And
the teacher there told me to stay away from computers because my code didn't run. And I'm not, as somebody who went on to become a lawyer, I'm quite accurate now, but I'm not naturally someone who's got that kind of application to be super accurate. I'm not good at languages. So none of my code ever ran. My ZX Spectrum didn't work. And I went off and I became a lawyer and started to work in industry in the late 90s. And I also did a master's in IP and IT law. To be honest, originally I wanted to be an entertainment lawyer. I was really interested in music and movies and things. And I ended up going from that IP piece completely accidentally to IT. And I did a master's, which included the first internet law course in the UK, and drifted into becoming an internet lawyer, .com lawyer that I was reasonably well known for back around 2000. And then in 2008, I joined a company in London called Canonical, where I was meant to be on a 3-month contract to work out what their legal needs and legal team should look like and where. And I think within 6 weeks, they asked me to stay as general counsel. And something really strange happened there for me, which was that I fell in love with open source software, which, really wasn't meant. I was a sort of corporate commercial tech lawyer. And the idea that I would, really want to stay in this space and software hadn't occurred to anybody. And I guess that was 15 years ago. And I worked there for 5 years. And I did a couple of years in a law firm purely advising around open source and startups. And then after that, I've worked in a number of different spaces. In 2018, I decided I'd had enough. 25 years was long enough for anybody to be a lawyer. And I didn't know what to do. And by 2019, I'd found OpenUK. A couple of other people had set the organization up, hadn't done anything with it. So it was a shell. And I took that shell and engaged a lot of people over the last 3 and a bit years, and have been lucky enough to raise quite a fair bit of money for it, and to bring people together, I hope, in the UK, focusing on open technology.
Absolutely love that. My son always says to me that, Dad, nobody had a great story from things going right. And I love how your story, it is. You started out there and it was a bit of a disaster with that ZX Spectrum, and you pursued a career in law, and now you've come full circle in tech. And in 2,300 interviews on this podcast, I've had so many similar stories, and the amount of people that have mentioned ZX Spectrum or Commodore 64, it was such a magical time, wasn't it, back then?
In a way, it might not be a bad thing, because at the time, I really loved Pac-Man, and I still have a Pac-Man in my house now, and I can spend days obsessively playing computer games, which probably most people don't know or wouldn't expect of me. So it's possibly just as well that at that age, I didn't get into a computer. Or maybe I would have been a great hacker. Who knows?
Yeah. There's still time. Who knows where things could be? But of course, here in 2023, open source software has become more important to businesses, to all the new digital services that we all rely on every single day of our lives. We've got cloud services, mobile phones based on Android, streaming sites such as Netflix and Spotify, but we all just almost take them for granted, as I said. And open source has become more critical to how these services get built. I'm curious, how is security planning and governance kept up? Because traditionally, that's been the biggest challenge, right?
It's interesting. So I often refer to open source as the base of the pizza. And we look at all these things that you've just mentioned and many more, cloud, the internet, AI, ML, and they're all sort of like toppings. They're all the sexy bits that people debate and like one or want to be involved in one. Yeah. And they all sit on this base, and this base is the infrastructure of a pizza. And with open source software, it's the infrastructure of our technology. And from that perspective, if you were looking at your pizza and you took the base away, all those other things would be a sloppy mess. So actually, we really need that base. We need that infrastructure. And that's what open source gives us today. Whether we're looking at the enterprise or the public sector, in a digitalized world, it is all based on open source software. I don't think anybody would really argue with that today. And what that's done is it's put open source right at the center of things, where we have concerns, not just about open source, but about all software being vulnerable. And we see in a digitalized world that the public services that we come to expect from our governments, or services that we expect from companies, are totally reliant on it. And that creates a challenge. And again, it's not an open source specific challenge, but that digitalized world creates a challenge around security, as you've mentioned, with bad actors, with vulnerabilities. And I suppose there are two schools of thought around this. One would say that proprietary is safer, and the other would say that open source are more secure, and the other would say that open source is more secure. Obviously, I'm in the latter camp. And what I'm going to say is that there are challenges around vulnerabilities. We've seen it with things like Log4j. And what we see there is a project that's maintained by a couple of people where 8 million platforms were impacted by security vulnerability. And that's a one-to-many kind of scale that we see for open source maintainers and contributors versus the users is very, very common today. And what we have to think about is understanding that supply chain, which is something a lot of governments are already focusing on with software bill of materials, making sure that we understand the dependencies in the software. And that's, it's not quite infinite, but that's a huge historical sort of artifact list that we have to go back through. And we'll never, ever get that completely right. It's just too big. But we can look at supply chain and software bill of materials, and it is a good thing to help fix the overall picture. But it's one component part in the security picture. And we really have to be taking a holistic view, a risk-focused view on the software. And the critical thing here about open source is that it's distributed free, so it's distributed without liability. So when we look at its use case, we have to think about how it's used and who is using it, because they're responsible for that software. They've selected it, they've brought it into the environment, and they have to manage how it's used. So they should be looking for projects or code that has a good community behind it, that's going to be well maintained. Single vendors always create some concern. We should be looking at how that's implemented, that there's good technical hygiene, that there's good governance. So it goes beyond security, as you mentioned, into governance. And I think we are at risk of becoming a victim of our own success. And there is a risk, I think, that open source could be a failed concept because of it. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen so much adoption, so much usage, that a lot of people who are using it don't really understand what they've got there and how to use it. And what we need is better education, better skills around technical implementation and governance and good practices in open source to make sure that as it's being used in the safest, most secure way, that it's being used if it's in a regulated sector, for example, in compliance with laws. And we really need to be thinking about how we educate on that. But we also need to be thinking about how we fund to make sure that those people I mentioned, those maintainers and contributors, the one-to-many, are also being both financially and resource-wise supported. And giving them money is an important thing, but it also needs to be done in a way that's joined up, that's cross-border, that's international, that includes governments and enterprises. And then building those skills is really important so that we have the resource to support both in the organizations using, but also back at the maintainer and creator level so that we're supporting them. And right now, I think there's a gap in the education system and in vocational training where there's not enough focus on open source and really understanding it.
Yeah, 100%. And as you said, we're surrounded by open source projects, and they vary so much from small projects put together to meet a specific need right the way through to VC-funded commercial open source companies. And I'm curious, if we zoom out for the moment, just to bring to life everything that we're talking about, what are some of the key issues you're seeing here around things like security, but also creating a sustainable business or how to support these projects? Is there any trends around this that you're seeing?
There's a chap called Mike Bracken who was the digital director that created GDS in the UK, and he spoke at an OpenUK event back in October, and he's going to be speaking in our plenaries at the State of OpenCon. And I had been saying that there are a limited number of business models that work with open source. So if you give away your assets, if you give away your crown jewels and your IP in the way that open source is shared, you can't restrict other people's usage. They can use it any way they want for any purpose. So they can use it commercially and make money, and they can compete with you. If you do that, there are maybe 7, 8 different ways that you can commercialize things like providing support, subscription services, open core, where you have proprietary as well. And Mike said he thought there was a new business model. Now, I don't know if I would call this a business model, but it goes back to what I was just saying, and that there is a need for government funding. So what you can't have is the scale of usage we see today without contribution back. And I think open source in many ways is correcting the past in the way that software was created and distributed. It's a sort of personal opinion. However you want to view it, we have this movement, this moment in time where we now see the majority of software being open source. Some of it is created by companies, and some of it's created by projects with commercial sponsors. Some of it's company collaborations. But we also have code coming from individuals and from, groups of individuals who are scratching an itch. And what we need to see is this government funding. And what worries me is that we see certain countries really taking a lead on that and understanding it. And it can't work unless we see this happen in a joined up way. It has to be cross-border in the same way that open source is global. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, 100%. And I'm curious, we all have people listening all over the world in something like 165 countries, but I always try and put wherever the guest is on the map and understand what's going on in that region. So here in the UK, where would you say we are with open source right now?
Interesting. So we are a massive adopter and we're a massive contributor. And I would suggest it's because we have amazing engineers who are not very good at self-promotion, that this is not known anywhere near the way it should be. So GitHub produced a report, and we're about to produce an OpenUK report next week, so it'll be out before this podcast, which includes this fact. And in the UK, GitHub has 2.8 million user accounts. Now, they won't all be developers. There are people like me that have them. They won't all be business people. There are students who have them. Some will be community, and some people will have multiple accounts. But those variables apply equally across the world. Now, India has 9 million, which is 3 times the size, but the population of India is a lot more than 3 times the size. The nearest in Europe is Germany with 2 million. France is 1.9, and then the other European countries are way behind. So I would suggest that in the UK, with 4.1% of our population holding GitHub accounts, that we are undisputedly one of the biggest contributors to open source anywhere in the world. The US comes in just behind us, but right now their population data is out of date, so they might go just ahead of us. But being, joint equal or just behind the US wouldn't be a bad thing either. And it brings me to a point of despair at the moment that we cannot get people to recognize that this open source software space generates huge revenue with people who work from the UK, but work in roles all over the world, bringing, money into the economy. And we're not focusing anywhere in terms of funding open source in governments. And we really need to be. In terms of contribution, as I say, we're massive. In terms of utilization, about 10 years ago, the UK was one of the first countries in the world. Mike Bracken, Francis Maud, Liam Maxwell put in place an open first strategy for the UK in 2010, 11. And that permeated from the Cabinet Office across the public sector. We've seen it reiterated over the last few years. And what we see is fantastic adoption, but we still have that problem you raised on understanding. And I think what we now need beyond the adoption and the open first policy is to see some really good understanding and detailed practices sitting behind that so that people understand how to do it well. And the problem if we don't do that is that we go to open source primarily to save money. I wish it wasn't. I wish it was because of all the great innovation and collaboration. But when you ask, people always say it's because they can save money. And you won't save money if you don't know what you're doing, because what you'll do and what we see in some instances in the public sector is they go to the same old suppliers, they ask them to build open source, they throw it over the wall onto GitHub, and you then end up with code without documentation, without contribution, without maintenance plans, with no community that nobody's going to touch. Which means that if you want it supported, you go back to the contractor that created it for you, and you pay them. I've asked one organization in the public sector how they were planning maintenance, and they said they had a 3-year contract. And that's proprietary to me. That's although in name it's open source, it doesn't get the open source goodness and value. So I think we really need to get an understanding. Otherwise, we create code that will still have vendor lock-in and that will not be reused and recycled. And the goal is to avoid that lock-in, to make code that can be reused and recycled, and really to understand that good hygiene. There's a term, curation. A chap called Eric Brewer at Google was the first person I heard use it. And Eric's also part of our plenaries at the conference. He and I are doing a fireside chat about exactly this. And that curation, understanding those good practices around open source, needs to be high up the government agenda for the public sector, I think. And of course, for enterprises.
Yeah, and so much of what you just said there will resonate with tech teams and business leaders listening all over the world. Another question I've got to ask for the consumers listening. Let's face it, we're all end users and consumers of this technology too. So what is the end result of all this for consumers out there? Should we care about how our software gets put together and where it comes from? Because for the most part, people don't care as long as it works, right? That's got to change.
Do you care if your hospital falls down because the bricks haven't been well laid?
Yeah, of course.
Honestly, I think that we should care.
Yeah.
I don't think we can expect the mass of the population to have detailed understanding of technology. It's not, most people don't work in it, although I think we'll see more base understanding over the next few years across the board. And I think people have become much more aware since Apple created the iPhone in 2008. We've had a trajectory over the last 15 years. And I think that there is a lot more interest amongst people. And, they're aware that they're using digital things to access services. Often you can't access them unless you can work the digital tools. So we are seeing a shift. And I think people are increasingly interested in knowing what's behind it. And when they understand that you might be relying on corporates, and then they understand that there might be something that's interoperable, that belongs to everybody, or at least all the contributors, that's slightly different, right? And I think that does appeal to people.
Completely agree with you. And you've also mentioned a couple of times today the state of OpenCon, a recent conference of yours, and you've been able to get people from all over the world, some pretty big names to that conference. But can you tell everyone listening a little about it, what you wanted to achieve, and why an event like this is so crucial here in the UK?
Yeah, so the UK hosts some fantastic small open source conferences, things like Kubernetes Community Days. DevOps Live has a lot of open source in it, and there's some great meetups across the UK. We used to have one or two bigger conferences a decade plus ago. And then we have the odd visitors like the Linux Foundation who've done great conferences in the UK, but we don't have anything that's generated by the UK. And the work that we've done over the last 3 years at OpenUK, you can imagine building an organization like this in lockdown. It's been primarily digital. We haven't brought together massive amounts of people to spend time working together, meeting each other, learning together. And I think there's a real gap there. A number of people fed back to me last year that there wasn't a good big tech conference in the UK because they were all run by these companies that do multiple kinds of conferences, and that there was a real need for a good tech conference full stop, let alone an open source one or an open technology one. So we're not just open source, it's open source software, open hardware, and open data that's been covered. And our friends at the Open Data Institute have put together the Open Data Room. They've been fantastic. And we have Jimmy Wales from Wikimedia as one of our keynotes. I think there's a need for it because all of the stuff that we've talked about today about how much the UK does in this space, both as a contributor and a user, it needs to get better awareness. There needs to be more public perception of what this is, public awareness of what this is. But also we need to create a space where we can start to bring these people together. And what we did was we've gone out and raised several £100,000 of funding so that we could put together a conference that had a very, very subsidized ticket price at $199. This is probably the toughest market we could have done this in. So you'll have seen, as I have, all the tech layoffs, companies removing all their marketing funds. So the amount we've raised is quite incredible in this environment. But also companies are not letting people go to conferences. So what we've done is we've put together free tickets for people who are between roles. We've put together student and community free tickets, and also tickets for people who simply are either in startups or the companies won't pay for them to go. We want people to be there, even if it costs us to have them. So we've been lucky to have raised that money to create a space, and that space is really for everyone to get together. And in my job, I spend a lot of time at conferences. And I was quite shocked during lockdown that I wasn't at them. And then I started to go back to them April, May last year and spent 6 months where I was on the road a lot. And to be honest, it was interesting to watch how people reacted. They wanted to be together. And there were certain conferences where the talk rooms were packed, and then certain conferences where nobody was showing up at them. And it was just, I was trying to work out why and how that was. And what I don't want or didn't want to create is a vendor-driven conference. So we have no vendors paying for talks, which is why we've got the quality of talks that we've got. And there are 130 plus people speaking. All of the content is live streamed for those who are not comfortable or can't get to the venue. So all of the content of the talks is live streamed. It's all recorded, and it will be available for free download afterwards, unlimited download, so people can access the information. But we got 130 people through our call for papers, a CFP process, which again isn't that common in the UK, but is very common in open source. And then we've got another 170 people or organizations involved between our sponsors. IEEE had come in there as a headline sponsor, which made it possible for us to start the process and book the venue. But we have a whole load of other sponsors who've joined that. We have a load of gifted sponsors, as we call them, who are doing stuff in kind for us. We have a volunteer advisory board. We have a volunteer workforce who'll be manning the building, hosting the building for us. And then we have what we're calling DX, Delegate Experience. And we've got 48 organizations, whether they're projects, foundations or enterprises, and some academics in there too, Cambridge and Turing Institute, hosting tables. And it's pretty simple. You get a table with 2 chairs, you put a pop-up banner up and you talk to people. So we've given everybody the same space. There's nothing fancy for the corporates. We've given them free to the projects and the foundations. And then we've created another layer of DX around experiential things, stuff you can go and do where you'll meet people you don't know. So we've got Boeing giving us virtual reality headsets where you can do a flight simulation or go into space. We've got Avanade with a 3D printer. We've got another virtual experience from the BBC, something called Searching for New Gods with Gruff Rees, which they did at the Science Museum, all of which are on open source. So, you've got all these different things going on for people. And then we've tried to make it convenient with amenities. So we have things like gender-neutral toilets, a prayer room. We have doggy daycare, a creche, all the bits that you would need to be able to conveniently go to a conference. I've mentioned we raised a lot of money, but paying for catering is difficult. And we've managed to get to a stage where we are paying for soup and a sandwich at lunchtime and snacks in the afternoon for people. So nobody will go hungry. But it won't be fancy catering. We don't quite have the money for that. Yeah. And then we've tried to put diversity and sustainability at the heart of everything we do. And I would challenge you to show me a conference that is more diverse. And we've done that by scoring the papers that come in for the proposals with a diversity and a sustainability criteria in them. And then we've asked every speaker to make sure that they acknowledge those 2 themes within what they're doing. And we also brought on board a sustainability sponsor, woodlands.co.uk, who own woods in the south of England. And they're going to plant a deciduous tree for every delegate who attends to try and help offset a bit. We've asked people to tell us how far they've come and what their mode of transport is. And by next year, we'll have a better idea. So we'll be able to do that more accurately. But we thought it was a start. So, and I forgot the tents. We've got festival tents being built on the lawn outside the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre, next to Westminster Abbey, just across the road from Big Ben on Parliament Square, which I think will draw the attention. So we've built something really different, which will be more of a festival than a conference, but have a traditional conference within it. It has an unconference. Sustain Open Source Software is running their conference within a conference themselves. It's got all sorts going on that I hope will attract people. But I think year one, it'll be a learning for people. And my biggest lesson has been that when you do something totally different, you have to take a lot of time to explain it to people. And we've built all of this in 10 weeks, 9.5 so far. So there's still a bit of learning, around that, still a bit of education to encourage people to come along. And I suspect by year 2, it will be much easier to get them to come along.
Wow, absolutely inspirational. And as someone that's guilty of doom scrolling down my newsfeed or flicking through 24-hour news channels now and again, it's easy to fall into the trap of forgetting just how well the UK is doing tech. And I just love the inspiring work that you're doing here. It is absolutely a welcome and refreshing antidote to all the doom and gloom that we see out there. And did you say that after the event, everything's going to be online, so we'd be able to link to it for the listeners to check that out?
Absolutely. And it should, by the time this podcast comes out, we've got this wonderful man, Peter, who is going to be doing all the video editing and thinks he can do it in a week or so. So by the time your podcast comes out, we can give you a link to where you can go and see it all.
Fantastic. I'll do just that. And looking towards the future, what is the future for open source? What changes do you think you'll see around things like collaboration and governments? And how's that going to equally affect the future of how software gets developed in general?
It's really interesting. So Jimmy Wales is going to be talking about some of the restrictions around open data and the problems that those cause. The new regulation, online harms bill, is causing for Wikimedia. I've seen this morning a law being proposed in the EU, a chat law, which the open source community is up in arms about. They're worried about mass surveillance, as all citizens will be, but they're also worried about the impact it'll have on open source operating systems. And I think the EU is a great example because we've seen recently a Cyber Resilience Act as well. Regulation that I know, having spoken to some of the people behind it, is well intended, but just lacks understanding. And I think we're at a critical point, and open source is either going to become the establishment and the future. And, you know, this hippy dippy area that I started in when nobody wanted to listen to us about it will become such a mainstream thing. It already has become a mainstream thing that it will just be the norm and accepted. And we'll teach people the good practices, or it'll fail. And it'll fail miserably because people don't understand it and haven't taken the time to learn.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to share your story with me today. I know how busy you are right now. And we started the podcast talking about your origin story, what put you on this path. And as we come full circle, I'm going to ask you, was there a song that is the soundtrack to your journey, or a book that has inspired you, or something that you can leave everyone listening with? Maybe it's your power song that comes on to when you give a keynote. Whatever it is, all I'm going to ask is, what are you going to leave us with and why?
It's funny for many reasons, because I let you choose what you ask me rather than me ask something specific. And I hadn't even seen that one in the list of questions. So I have no prep for it. And I am looking at going on stage to a song by DJ Fresh, a chap called Dan Stein, who is a software engineer. He's a Kubernetes engineer, engineering manager. And I'm hoping might be at the conference, but definitely will be next year. And I'm looking at going on to hit a song he did with Paloma Faith called Hot Right Now. But what we've done is we've put together a list of British songs that we will use for people going on stage. So possibly that. And then personally, I will confess to sitting away from everybody else before every exam I've ever done, listening to Four Non Blondes. I don't even know what it's called.
What's going on? It's got to be.
Yes, right? Yes. I was going to say Great Big Hill of Hope, you know. But yeah. So listening very loudly to that before every exam I've ever done the whole of my life.
Oh, two great songs. I'm feeling in a good mood. I'm going to put both of those on our Spotify playlist. And for anyone listening that just wants to find out more information about you, the work that you're doing, check out some of the state of the OpenCon and some of the keynotes. What's the best starting point for everything?
Yeah, so stateofopencon.com will get you straight into the content for the conference. We put it separately to make it easier to find. OpenUK.uk website, amandabrock.com website. And then we are on Mastodon, but it's still early stage for us. So Twitter is still a haunt. And you'll get me at Amanda Brock UK and OpenUK at OpenUK_UK and LinkedIn.
Fantastic. I'll add all those links to the show notes so people can find you nice and easy. So much I've loved about chatting with you today. I always say at the end of every episode that technology works best when it brings people together. And this is exactly what you're doing here. And I love how it all began with a ZX Spectrum and a career in the legal world. And you've come full circle, and the work you're doing is genuinely inspirational. So just a big thank you for sharing your story today.
Thank you very much for having me.
A huge thank you to Amanda for coming on and sharing her story today. And I urge anyone listening to check out the conference that we talked about there. I'll include links on the show notes. So many great keynotes and so much to learn from everything that was created there. Absolutely inspirational. I'd love to get Amanda back on in the near future. But if you'd like to come on, or you've got any questions for me, whatever it may be, please email me now, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. And my website, if anyone would like to work with me, is just techblogwriter.co.uk. But that's it for today. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.